Greetings and welcome to Phillips Theological Seminary and our fourth annual Black Histories and Native American Lands lecture. It is my pleasure to welcome you. We were planning to be on campus today and to have everyone meet our speaker tonight, but due to inclement weather, we have pivoted, and thanks to the marvels of 21st century streaming and technology, we're still able to get our speaker from California to Salt Lake to Atlanta and finally to Tulsa. And so I'm Arthur Carter, Director of Black Church Traditions and African American Faith Life at Phillips. And on behalf of our Dean and Vice President, Lisa Davison, and our President, F. Douglas Poe Jr., I again welcome you to this lecture. Today's lecturer, Kyle T. Mays, is an Afro-Indigenous writer and scholar of U.S. history, urban studies, race relations, and contemporary popular culture. If you look at the breadth of his scholarship, it has very specific threads that run through it, but he engages and writes on a number of different aspects. He celebrates the diverse aspects and the multiple parts of peoples and cultures and individuals' identities that are evident and present in history. He's an associate professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. He is the author of Hip Hop Beats, Indigenous Rhymes, Modernity, and Hip Hop in Indigenous North America. That was published in 2018 by SUNY Press. He's also the author of An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. That marvelous work, not that the other one wasn't, but that marvelous work and celebrated work was published in 2021 with Beacon Press. He is also the publisher, the author of City of Dispossessions, Indigenous Peoples, African Americans, and the Creation of Modern Detroit. That work was published in 2022 by the University of Pennsylvania Press. He contributed a chapter called Blackness and Indigeneity to the New York Times bestseller 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019 in 2021. Dr. Mays works broadly across multiple disciplines and explores three main questions. What is the relationship between Blackness and indigeneity? How does dispossession in cities shape the lives of Black and Indigenous peoples? And finally, how can we imagine and put into praxis a world in the aftermath of settler colonialism and white supremacy? We are very blessed and fortunate to have Dr. Mays with us here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as we at Phillips Theological Seminary seek to fill the gaps in the lacuna of scholarship and discourse on the various multiplicities and intersectional identities of people in history and populations that exist today. We attempt to celebrate and to engage and to take critically our position and place here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a land that has been home to many indigenous peoples, has been the home and the site of travesty and genocide and dispossession and displacement, and often places individuals of various subject positions and identities in the crosshairs of empire, in the crosshairs of survival, and at the interstitial spaces of misunderstanding and homogeneity. And so it is with this that we celebrate, welcome, and look to learn and hear from our speaker for tonight.
Thank you, Brother Arthur Carter, for having me, and thank you to all the wonderful people that made the event happen. Even though we're not in person, I'm still here in the flesh, cold as ever. It's been a while since I've been in the cold, and I thought LA was cold recently. Clearly, that's just not true. So, very glad to be here, and I consider Tulsa a special place for many reasons. It's just an important place to talk about subjects relating to Black and Indigenous peoples. And while I won't be talking about Tulsa in particular today, it is certainly on my mind and some of the things that I'm working on. So, today's talk is focused on two very important topics to Black and Indigenous nations and communities today: reparations and decolonization, right? And this is, you're getting a preview to a book I'm finishing now. And I also forgot to mention, I was just promoted to full professor recently. So just kind of new professional title with way more administrative responsibilities now. So in today's talk, I'm gonna do a few things. First, what is the meaning of reparations for Black Americans? What's the relationship between decolonization indigenous sovereignty and Native peoples in the U.S.? And what can these relationships look like in the sort of outside of the realm of U.S. empire? And so first I'm going to begin with decolonization. I'm going to begin with reparations, then decolonization, a few historical examples of what's happening in California, although I think they're very much relevant here, even in Tulsa, and then thinking about Afro-Indigenous futures. So we all know who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is, right? You know, if you're in the audience, raise your hand real quick, cool. Right, the Dr. King that is beyond the I Have a Dream speech, right? Critiquing the three evils, racism, militarism, capitalism. That Dr. King Poor People's Campaign advocating for $50 billion instead of funding wars, but instead funding ending poverty, guaranteed income, housing, those sorts of things, right? Poor People's Campaign. And for anyone who hasn't studied, looked at that version of Dr. King, please do so. I mean, it's some of those fascinating parts. I'm not talking about that today, even though I just briefly mentioned it. But he also had at least 300 Native activists who were very much a part of the Poor People's Campaign, which is not widely known. A few people have written about it, but it's not a widely known thing. And he is very much, Dr. King that is, very much so an advocate for a form of reparation that ended poverty. Even our politicians now, you know, every election cycle, middle class, middle class, middle class.
So we suffer from a kind of poverty of the spirit, which stands in glaring contrast to our scientific and technological abundance. The problem is, my friends, that we have learned to fly the air like birds, and we have learned to swim the seas like fish, and yet we haven't learned to walk the earth like brothers and sisters. Racial injustice is still the black man's burden and the white man's shame. So wherever we live in America, we have to face the fact honestly that racial discrimination is present. So don't get complacent. Certainly we've made some strides. We made some progress here and there, but it hadn't been enough. It hadn't been fast enough. And although we've come a long, long way, we still have a long, long way to go. In 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln. But the Negro was not given any land to make that freedom meaningful. And you know, it was something like having a man in jail for years and years, and then you suddenly discover that this man is innocent. And go to him and say, now you are free. The man's been unjustly jailed for 35 or 40 years, and you just put him out of jail saying, now you are free. You don't give him any bus fare to get to town, no money to buy any clothes, no money to get something to eat. This is what happened to the black man in this country. I can't limit my concern to the middle class. I can't limit my concern to this particular situation where a Negro comes and says, I'm the first this. I'm just tired of the first Negro. I want some seconds and some thirds and some fourths. The civil rights movement has to address itself to this, and the nation has to do it. You see, we are such a rich nation and affluent nation. We often don't see the poor. There are some, you see, Most white people can't see the poor because they live in the suburbs. And then they get in town in these big cities on expressways. They don't know nothing about Watts. They've never been there. They don't know anything about Huff in Cleveland or the west side or the south side of Chicago or Harlem. They've never seen it. And they allow the poor to become invisible. And a lot of Negroes, you know, who have somehow sailed or floated out of the backwaters or the muddy waters, and they've kind of been able to ease out into the fresh-flowing waters of the mainstream, have forgotten the stench of the backwater. And I can hear a voice saying that wasn't enough. I was hungry, and you fed me not. I was naked, and you clothed me not. I needed shelter, and you didn't give it to me. I needed a drink of water. And in a world that's 3/4 water, you made me pay a water bill.
And in later speeches, he talks very specifically about the poor. And I implore everyone to remember the poor, right? The poor, the most disadvantaged, even thinking about the weather here in Tulsa right now. Surely there are unhoused people and poor people suffering, and that's a fault of society. So, reparations. What does it mean to repair, and what can reparations actually do? And I think it's certainly a worthwhile thing to consider. So, reparations, of course, repairing harm. So, not to get anyone's personal business, but if anyone has ever had a significant other, whatever, and they mess up, they apologize, right? And what do you want from an apology? Change behavior, of course. You also, maybe you want a nice gift, a nice dinner or something, a Gucci bag, whatever it is, right? to reconcile some sort of recompense for the harm that was caused. Same thing with reparations en masse for people. There's been various forms of reparations around the world and the U.S. as well, right? So it's trying to repair a past harm. And as it relates to nation states, it can come in different forms. State apologies, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, a la South Africa, and compensation, monetary, or so forth. And for the U.S. context, reparations tied to the enslavement of people of African descent and the racism that inhibited Black wealth building during the Jim Crow era due to racial discrimination, so housing, all sort of things. And many argue today that reparations should be in the form of cash payments. Some argue for land, some argue for interest-free loans to help build Black communities for self-determination, right? You can think of organizations like the Republic of New Africa, formed in Detroit in 1968, and they wanted the 5 southern states as to be a self-determined nation. You could also think of NCOBRA, the National Coalition for Reparations for People of African Descent, formed in September of 1987. And they were advocating like a pretty robust idea of what reparations can mean. There's also, which I'll talk about in a little bit, NARICROM in the Caribbean, right, as well. But let's go back to this period of Reconstruction and land. So land has been a central idea within the Black American experience. For example, during the era of Reconstruction, which I really encourage people, especially what's happening now, go reread Black Reconstruction and go reread Eric Foner's book on Reconstruction. You'll be upset, just like perhaps some of you might be now, but the history is fascinating and reveals a lot of what has happening and what might also happen. So Du Bois called Reconstruction really a splendid failure, one of the first times that democracy en masse had actually happened. Now, we'll table the discussion of what happened to indigenous peoples at the same time. But during the Civil War, there's a U.S. Revenue Act of 1862, and they confiscated land from the planter class, that is the Confederacy and the plantation owners. And after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, formerly enslaved people are able to actually purchase some land, and I'll get into a little more specifics. That is Special Field Order Number 15, declared later. There was this initial one, and then William Tecumseh Sherman in January of 1865. I'll come back to this. So they seized land in South Carolina, Georgia, approximately 245 miles, in Florida, and so some 40,000, just off rip, 40,000 formerly enslaved peoples received land, and they're supposed to work that land, gain some sort of title to it. Now, one of the questions was Sherman sort of a great emancipator? Why did he do it? He didn't really imagine that black people would have land for the entirety of their lives or generations. It was simply just to deal with the fact that they had all these formerly enslaved peoples following the army. And what did they want to do with them? Surely they wanted the South destroyed in the planter class. It wasn't really about destroying class dynamics per se. They're trying to figure out what to do with these people. The second argument was, what do we do with, should we just enter these formerly enslaved black people into laissez-faire market capitalism, or how much government intervention should actually exist? So there's two strong components to that. People like Frederick Douglass were very weary about white paternalism at the time, because for him, having experienced this in the anti-slavery movement, most notably with William Lloyd Garrison, who declared after slavery was abolished, my job is done, and then they booted him out as the president of the Anti-Slavery Society, because Douglass and others saw that black people still need the right to vote. So a brief timeline, no need to get caught up in the woods of the timeline. It's just to anchor you and how quickly things changed, and then how quickly things changed for the worse. So we went from like very good abolition democracy possibility to very bad very quickly. So the Freedmen's Bureau came into being, and it was really to help black people enter into the United States as citizens. Now, I want to say helping them enter into a settler democracy. The United States is a settler colonial nation state built on not only the enslavement of black people, but also the dispossession and ongoing dispossession of indigenous peoples in the U.S. But Andrew Johnson's Amnesty Act evicted thousands of freed people. So William Tecumseh Sherman's Act, Special Field Order number 15 in January, and then March, they're like, let's lease this land to freed peoples. And then by the summer, late summer, early fall, Johnson says, no, we cannot allow this to happen. And one of the major reasons why, my colleague Elena Roberts has pointed this out in her book, I've Been Here All a While, is that they could not imagine poor white men not getting land when these formerly enslaved people were also promised land and were going to get land. So they couldn't en masse give black people land without also giving it to white people as well. And so for that reason, they're like, we cannot do this. And thus, they began to return land to the plantation owner. And Du Bois, again, go read Black Reconstruction, say again and again, crudely but logically, the Negroes expressed their right to land and the deep importance of this right. And he makes the argument that for 250 years, black people had worked the land. And you hear the same sort of sentiment today. Therefore, because they were exploited on this land, they deserve that land. But the question has to be, upon whose land were they exploited? This is not to blame black people at all. They were forced to come here, kidnapped from their homelands, and then forced really to enter into a settler democracy. What choices did they have, right? If you go read the historical record, you have many black people advocating for homesteads. There can be some debate about how much they're participating in colonialism, but what choices did they have to do so otherwise? With the lack of information, and all they know is we should enter into the United States, be good citizens, work the land, and make money and be free, just like we've seen other people do. I mean, I mentioned these core ideological assumptions on reparations. So, right, and so if you ever want to have good, wholesome arguments based on evidence with people about why black people deserve reparations, check out William Darity and Kirsten Mullins' Where Does Black Reparations in America Stand? And it's an edited book called The Black Reparations Handbook, a handbook for racial justice that just came out in 2023. And so they say, we propose that a true reparations plan, rather than taking that vast amount of wealth off the table, must focus on the elimination of black-white wealth disparity at the mean rather than the median. In other words, they're simply saying black people deserve reparations as the mean or the average of what white Americans have. Now, Darity and his these are all black economists who studied this for a long time. They have a report from 2018 that says a white high school dropout has more wealth than a black graduate. Sounds wild, right? But trust me, go and read the report. I'm not making things up. I'm not lying to you as I'm talking to you. And if you don't believe me or them, I am not an economist. I'm just a boring historian. Go and check out their research. do your own regressions and find your own data and see if this is true. And they also argue that the U.S. owes $15 to $20 trillion for slavery and Jim Crow. Now, the United States, y'all think they're going to pay $15 to $20 trillion? Absolutely not, right? I think we can agree on that. It's like it's not happening. They won't even give health care, which is a whole nother history of why there's not universal health care in the U.S. It's mostly anti-blackness, among a few other factors. That's a main factor. Next, please. So contemporary examples of reparations. There's CARICOM, represent in the Caribbean. What I actually like about theirs, they also talk about the genocide that happened to indigenous peoples. And similar to NCOBRA, they're advocating for some sort of economic self-determination, cash payments. Importantly, the cancellation of debt, which I think is really important, especially in a place like Haiti, as well as European governments sort of, and we should say corporations as well. Repatriation of goods, establishment of museums, historical markers as well. All those things are important. The second one in California, which I've been following for the last few years, Bruce's Beach, which I'll get to back to in the next slide, taken by eminent domain. And then in 2022, the Bruce family, after receiving the land, sold the land back to the state of California for $20 million. I'll come back to that. And then if you follow the state of California's Reparations Commission in 2020, they sanctioned a study of reparations, and they had a few different reports about it. The California's Black Caucus introduced 14 reparations bills. Governor Newsom signed 6, and most recently, last summer and fall, people are very upset because there were not cash payments for reparations. So it's a whole lot of discussions in California. I think New York is now sanctioned a study. Evanston, Illinois has reparations through the form of a marijuana tax that they use to fund low interest loans to people to be able to buy homes who were kicked out. So it's a lot of various forms of reparations happening in municipalities as well as statewide. So common arguments against reparations, right? Where's the money going to come from? I mean, this is perhaps my own political stances here, but tax dollars, of course, right? And we do know that many corporations, whether it's Chase Bank, various universities, built their wealth off of the expropriation of indigenous land as well as enslavement, right? And so if you have billions of dollars in wealth, some probably trillions, even banks, think about the development of modern insurance companies in the U.S., the modern banking. Where did that come from? Slavery, land. We do know when the Brits abolished slavery, many of those families were compensated, and they're very wealthy today, right? Again, it's a strange question to ask, where's the money going to come from, when it's very clear based on history. Another comment, white people didn't enslave anyone, so today did not enslave anyone, therefore it should not be held for past harms. Certainly benefited from the ongoing discrimination against black people. And if you never checked out a book by Ira Katznelson called When Affirmative Action Was White, do check it out. He goes through all from the 1930s to the 1940s, all these bills that helped build the wealth of the modern, especially white middle class. One of my favorites, black people should just work hard and build the American dream. I believe Malcolm X called the American dream an American nightmare. And Darity and his co-writers have also dispelled this. Like, even something that I've heard for years now, keep the black dollar in the black community, they dispelled that very well. So I really encourage you to go read some of their reports. And it's widely available online, not behind any university paywalls. Other people say for reparations for Native peoples, they receive casinos. Listen, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. It's not reparations. And I haven't seen updated information, but only about 25 to 30% of casinos are actually profitable, right? As in making a large amount of money. As many of those casinos have to have pacts with the states and even provide gross monies, a small percentage, but to me, a percent is too much in my estimation. Next, please. So it's decolonization, right? I like to be very strict in the definition of decolonization. So if you've ever read Frantz Fanon, The Restoration of the Earth, do check it out. Although this comes from the chapter on violence, my favorite chapter, and he was following the decolonization movement that the Algerians had against the French. But my favorite chapter is actually on national culture. But decolonization is about the return of land and resources to indigenous peoples to be stewards of the land. It means to honor the treaties, right? Sometimes you hear things like decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing the university. And fundamentally, if it's not returning land to indigenous peoples, it's not decolonization, right? I want to make this clear so there is clarity for everyone, and we're very strict in how we use a term like decolonization. To me, that means returning land, and that colonialism has ended. There's a lot of discussions now in South Africa happening around colonization when the indigenous South Africans are asking for their land back. Now, as someone, you had a house, someone occupied that house, they put you in a park next to that house, and then you had the means to now reclaim that house. I'm certain many of you would want to reclaim that. And where would you want them to go? Back home, right? It might sound harsh, but I'm sure if someone just took something from you and you had the means to get it back, and you want them gone, right? I mean, I think there are humane ways to do that, but I don't think that would be, for me, reparatory justice. Next slide, please. So back to Bruce's Beach. The story is infuriating in a lot of ways, but the Bruce family opened this beach in 1912, and they only opened it because they were not allowed to go to the beach in Manhattan Beach. And so they're like, well, let's open up our own for us and for other black patrons. Became very successful. It had a lot of resentment from local communities, local white communities. And in 1920, George Lindsay, a real estate agent, I like to call him like one of the first haters around this topic, found a law from 1909 that if you want to, you can reclaim a place through eminent domain. And so they use this to take this land. If you were like, hey, we're going to make this into a state park or public area, then you could claim eminent domain and take this from people. Of course, this was not applied to anyone who was white who owned a beach. It was applied only to the Bruce family, and also stopped other families from opening resorts. So if you're following this timeline, all these things happened, and the Bruce family had to relinquish that land. And it wasn't until 2020, and there's a lot of history before then, like 2016 up until 2020, that went into looking at this. And if you've ever been to Manhattan Beach, I went just to go see it one time, and it's beautiful, amazing area, multi-million-dollar homes right on the beach, and just to imagine the wealth that was prohibited from the Bruce family from acquiring over time is astonishing. And while I'm not mad at them for selling it back to the state of California for $20 million, what about the money lost over that time, one? And two, certainly I thought, why can't they lease that land to anyone? But there's all these red flags for them as well. It's a challenge. Now, another part of that, when they had a press conference with the state of California acknowledging the past harms, acknowledging that they were accepting his $20 million. It brought a Tongva Gabrielino person, and that's the local tribal communities from Southern California and the Los Angeles area. And I thought this would have been a perfect opportunity to think about reparatory justice between Black and Native peoples outside of the purview of the colonial state. What could that have looked like? And I don't have an answer to that, but it got me thinking, what in that scenario could reparatory justice have looked like between Black and Native peoples, right? Limited options, surely, but we have to start imagining ways that we can do those things together. Next slide, please. Here's one that seems more controversial. So in the 1960s, 66, 64, 65, 66, the city of Palm Springs removed Black and Latino populations from Section 14, which is in downtown Palm Springs. If you've ever been to Palm Springs, very wealthy area, a lot of things happening. But it's on Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians. And so they leased land to Black families since the early 20th century, Black and Latino families, because they could not, those families could not get land elsewhere. And so by the 1950s, there were discussions about wanting to lease this land. And I saw an article in 2019 about the official Agua Caliente Band of Cahuilla Indians talking about this. And they didn't comment on this because right now, the descendants of the Black and Latino families are suing the city of Palm Springs for $2 billion. And so I was curious as to why the tribe had not commented on it. And so I'm a historian, so I was like, well, let me go look into this. So I spent like 4 or 5 days rummaging through archival records. And sure enough, in October of 1957, the tribal chairperson, Viola Ordon, went to Congress to talk about how they wanted that land developed. And they wanted to be able to lease that land to corporations. And so then I realized, bingo, this is why the tribe doesn't want to talk about this publicly, because even though some of their tribal members were impacted, they would also, in my estimation, based on the historical record, be culpable in the removal of these Black and Latino families, right? Complicated history for sure, but again, just like the Bruce's Beaches case, and very different in this scenario because the tribe is much more connected to this, what would reparatory justice look like for the tribe to say, one, I'm sorry, two, how can we repair our relationship because of the harm that we actually participated in, right? To me, just not commenting on it doesn't do anything. And if tribal nations are also going to be sovereign, they have the opportunity to have a form of sovereignty that is just, and in this case, related to the Black and Latino families who are removed, right? So I'm writing on this in greater detail in the book, which is hopefully out sometime next year, but that's up to me to finish. Next slide, please. Where can we find solidarity? I mean, I always get this sort of question, and one person I consistently return to is Stokely Carmichael, who changed his name to Kwame Ture. Now, if you don't know who Kwame Ture is, in Greenwood, Mississippi, in June 11, 1966, after the March Against Fear, he began to shout, "Black power, Black power, Black power." And he became sort of an icon in that. Now, what most people don't realize is, surely he was an advocate for Black power, Pan-Africanism, scientific socialism, and those things. But he was very much an advocate for Native people and their self-determination. Right? And in my own analysis of history, which I've talked about in an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States, he's one of the few, if not only, Black person or people to actually say this is Native people's land and not Black people's land. Right? He was very clear about that, and he was in solidarity with Native activists. This is him here in this photo at the American Indian Movement headquarters in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1975 when he's giving this speech. And he's trying to say Black and Native people need to be connected, need to be in solidarity, need to resist capitalism, and also a certain nationalism that benefits both. Right? He showed up to the Trail of Broken Treaties when Native people took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in 1972, and throughout his life. And, if there's a student who needs a research project, I'm sorry to get too old to do new research projects now, go look at, he's a great theoretician of settler colonialism, actually, globally. And I don't think he gets enough credit for his contributions to understanding and unpacking what that means, both on the African continent and elsewhere. So go check out Toure. Next slide, please. More evidence of solidarity. So this is Bob Brown, who is a part of the All African Revolutionary People's Party, Vernon Belcourt, and this is at the annual International Indian Treaty Council in White Earth Reservation. So here you have a black person involved in sort of transnational indigenous solidarity movements, also connected with the United Nations. And I think there's a lot more research that so certainly go into this sort of topic. And but again, solidarity is about showing up and being a part of movements that don't always directly benefit you. Although if you believe in global solidarity, humanity, like I do, right, I think these things benefit you, but immediately maybe you don't benefit from them. But I like the activity of Bob Brown and other folks who are like, we should be as black people in solidarity with indigenous nations. Next slide. I'm going to end here if there are any questions or comments, but this statement, so if you know Huey P. Newton, co-founder of the Black Panther Party, his birthday was actually just a few days ago. He has a theory called intercommunalism. And he makes a point, someone who believes in dialectical materialisms, and he said, we believe that there are no more colonies or neo-colonies. If a people is colonized, it must be possible for them to decolonize and become what they formerly were. And he says, but what happens when the raw materials are extracted and labor is exploited within a territory dispersed over the entire globe? When the riches of the whole earth are depleted and used to feed gigantic industrial machine in the imperialist's home, then the people and the economy are so integrated into the imperial empire that it's impossible to decolonize to return the former conditions of existence. If colonies can't decolonize and return to their original existence as nations, then the nations no longer exist, nor we believe will they exist again. And I think this is instructive for also discussing what tribal sovereignty means as well. What does it mean when resources are extracted and sent abroad, right? In what ways can tribal nations decolonize? Are they neo-colonies? And when you think about solidarity and thinking about tribal sovereignty, in what ways is it compatible or continue to contribute to American empire or capitalism by not challenging the fundamental nature of U.S. empire, right? Existing side by side, especially where we are now, is no longer viable in my estimation, and we have to think beyond the U.S. nation state. And we tribal nations certainly should not tie their destiny up to the United States in this capacity, and I don't see it as a viable option. Finally, thinking in terms of solidarity, what can tribal nations do? You know, we have a clan system in many of our tribes. What can tribal nations do to adopt, connect with black people on the land, right? These people are kidnapped, indigenous peoples from their own homeland, and they were forced to be here. Maybe there's been some blunders on the way, but how can we make new forms of kinship to be in harmony with one another and centering the land in that harmony? I'll end there and looking forward to questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that stimulating and informative lecture, Dr. Mays. And there's a little bit of lag between our stream and everyone that's watching online. Anyone that's online, please use our YouTube chat to engage with Dr. Mays and to offer any comments, congratulations, questions, queries. Dr. Mays is really looking forward to engaging and fielding some of your questions. And while we give our online audience an opportunity to do that, I would just like to engage some of the things that you brought up. It's a fascinating lineage that you really, or trajectories that you give all the way from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Panther Party and Black Power. I'm curious, as you begin thinking about with these very specific definitions of decolonization, within theological education and often within various locations, people center notions of justice around morality and ethics. Right. And as you are framing this book on reparations and solidarity and justice, where does this, because when we're talking about William Tecumseh Sherman and we're talking about all of these other opportunities, these examples that you have, where is the heart, the root of justice? Is it in economic well-being? Where are you seeing these pursuits, both of solidarity and justice? Like, where is it? Is it a moral? Is it an ethical thing? Is it a notion of self-interest? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, economic justice, in a sense, is returning the wealth and land to Native peoples, right? I want to center indigenous peoples in that land. And then once we figure that out, we have more contradictions to deal with now. Because I was at least gesturing towards that Black people were forced here, have lived here, have some relationship to this land, right? Now, how do we integrate indigenous ideas of stewardship? And certainly I think there are Black communities who have engaged and continue to engage in stewardship. So I'm just talking sort of a very mainstream sense. Getting people to understand you don't have to own things in sort of a private property manner. In other words, a form of re-education would have to occur. You know, once this land was returned, we are all stewards of it. How do we relate to one another? And this is why I was sort of ending with the clan system. Like, clan system, I'm Bear Clan with my own tribe, and it's how you relate to other people, what your responsibilities are. And to me, that also means your responsibilities not only to people, but to land and non-human species as well. And so it is both moral and ethical in a sense. And when folks are like cash payments, and I'm not talking about the most vulnerable in our society, so poor people, trans folks as well, right? Like, I live in LA, Skid Row's right there. People need diapers, food, housing, shelter, all those things right now. But people tend to focus on that, but they don't fundamentally critique, for example, racial settler capitalism as foundational to all of our similar forms of oppression. But people just want an entry into that. Newsflash for everyone, you're not going to be a billionaire. This is not happening. Like, the only billionaire I'm defending is Rihanna. That's a whole nother matter, right? Don't tell nobody outside of this stream, y'all. Don't tell anyone else. But these are the real questions that folks, when I like to say mainstream rappers, don't often think about. Certainly there are different activist communities who do, but mainstream sense, and sometimes we think our most radical ideas are mainstream. They are not. I mean, plenty of folks have shown that, a few studies, that Black people might be, for example, vote Democratic overwhelmingly. Shout out to Black women again on that. Ideas around social conservatism are way more conservative than we like to imagine.
Thank you. Just a quick question from the John Hope Franklin Center for Reconciliation. A query, didn't the NMAI in Washington, D.C. have an exhibit in 2019 on this? Do you have any comments or feedback or reflections on that, if they did?
I mean, yeah, there's an exhibit, but again, the tribe they don't comment on their role in this, and it's in the congressional record. I like to, I mean, if someone doesn't want to, if someone wants to go look at the congressional record, October 1957, go look at it. And they won't comment on the particular lawsuit that these Black and Latino family descendants have engaged with. Again, some of the tribal members were impacted by this too. Local conservators, guardians, they're stealing land. The tale as old as time with the native land, right? But it is clear that the tribal nation wanted this land developed for money, right? At least ideologically, they're involved and they advocated for it. It doesn't mean they physically went and said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But you participate in the conditions that led to that. And I think that's equally important when we talk about reparatory justice.
Appreciate that. You mentioned Elena Roberts and her excellent work. She really does a excellent job of revealing and disclosing the triangulation of empire and how various individuals are triangulated to maintain the economic, the power, the political system of empire. So you have blacks pitted against indigenous individuals, pitted against whites, Europeans, so forth and so on. And so when we're thinking about, can you say a little bit more about this, the role that triangulation has played in pursuit of reparations and reparatory justice?
Ooh, that's deep right there. So I think one of the key things that has happened is, I'll go back to Reconstruction. When Du Bois says that poor working class white people chose a public and psychological wage of being white, he means they're not getting more money. They might get a crumb here or two, whatever. But they chose these things to access whiteness in the public sphere at the detriment of poor and working class black people, and in this case, very recently formerly enslaved people. They threw that away. The other part of that is we tend to table in our discussion of Reconstruction what's happening to Native peoples at the same time. During the Civil War and immediately right after, there's all sorts of the Homestead Act, 1862, all sorts of land expropriation that's happening at the same time. Lincoln, in 1962, hangs 38 Dakota peoples during that time as well. So to talk about triangulation, and we'll say here black, white, indigenous, notions of settler capitalism, empire, you have to think about those things simultaneously. And I think as teachers, as researchers, sometimes we don't, I mean, except for Elena apparently, she did an amazing job doing this, showcasing this. She's really smart and amazing history, but we don't do a good job of like talking about all of those simultaneously. And sometimes it's difficult. Because, again, how do you explain poor white people, Native people being dispossessed, enslaved people, and then Reconstruction? All these things are just exploding and coming together in a very short amount of time. And then they go away. And what Foner makes in his book on Reconstruction, the great point he makes is, those things happen so quickly, there's such possibility. And then it completely was, deliberately dismantled. And it set the stage for race and class relations in the U.S. Well into the 1960s. And I would argue even up to the contemporary. Of course we had a great moment of possibility, second Reconstruction, and then it always reminds me, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, Derek Bell's theory of interest convergence. People don't, the boogeyman critical race theory, which, again, I didn't learn until undergrad, and I'm at UCLA with a bunch of my colleagues who are way more educated than me on critical race theory in law school, by the way. No kids are learning critical race theory unless it's at home. And the whole theory is that the United States passed the Brown v. Board of Education because of other issues, other pressure. And so you never get things rolling without some outside force. They don't do things out of their goodwill. And in that case, it was the Cold War, global racial politics, decolonization efforts on the African continent. And those things helped change, in addition to the activism folks here in the U.S.
Thank you. I've got two questions. Feel free to take them in whatever order you see fit. And the first is, I love the way your work tackles the twin sins of chattel slavery and settler colonialism, but I wonder where patriarchy fits in. How do we help recreate the indigenous matriarchies?
Well, one, cis hetero men, we got to do way better. One. Two, I mean, you really have to think about, and I think it begins much younger, actually. One thing I've been thinking about over the last several years is what kind of ceremonies existed to bring young men into manhood that existed historically. You know, your first kill, as in hunting, could be your first kill in warfare, could be, you know, stealing an enemy, tribes, horse, or whatever it is, right? That brings you into manhood. There's a ceremony celebrating, and you're instructed in how to do those. What kinds of ceremonies and things do we have now to replicate that in the 21st century, right? And I think that is, especially for young men, that is something we have to figure out. And I think sometimes we use terms like traditional. This is how we've always done things, ignoring that Native people have always been adaptable to various things. Sometimes you got to create something new, which is as native as one can be, right? You just adapt. And I think ceremonies and just mentorship are very important.
I love the fact that you just brought up ritual and ceremony. And newness also, the adaptability, especially in an institution like Phillips, Institution of Theological Education, that is ripe for conversation and investigation. Additional question, how do historically Black towns in Oklahoma fit into some of your thinking?
Well, they don't right now because I'm not writing on that. But I think it's certainly worth thinking about, surely. That's all I'll say about that.
And this is on me. Could you, and we have a number of his works available at the Phillips Theological Seminary Library. Please use our library. Our librarians love for you to use our library. We have a couple of contests and giveaways that will be available over the next couple of weeks. We'll be giving away some of Dr. May's books. But this is a great opportunity for you, kind of like a little snippet of these marvelous works that you've published. So we do have a question specifically asking about some of the differences, some of the different works that you've published.
Oh, this is like, I was telling Arthur, I never read my old books. Once they're out and about, I have no idea what's in them anymore. But that's a bit facetious, of course. But so, Indigenous hip hop was my way of talking about Black and Indigenous cultures and how Native people have constructed modern identities through hip hop culture, because I was tired of seeing old painting of Sitting Bull on some artistic thing. And I'm like, yo, everybody's doing hip hop. Why don't we talk about it? It is still a Native thing to do. So that's kind of the inspiration for that book. In Afro-Indigenous history, I wanted to talk about Black and Native histories that were not necessarily about the 5 tribes. I think it's important. We're in Oklahoma, very important in a certain sense, but to me, it dominates discussions, which, for example, was not my identity growing up, was not the identity of my cousins, various people I knew. There's a lot of relationships between personal identities of Black and Native peoples that are outside of the 5 tribes. Second, with that, I wanted to think about the foundations of U.S. democracy, which I would say are based on the enslavement of Black people and dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And how do we think of a Black and Indigenous future outside of settler colonialism and white supremacy? Hopefully, I at least engage those topics in the book. The final one was to talk about how dispossession as a practice shaped the development of modern Detroit from its founding up until a little into the present. So that's the family history in there. For example, to my Judy Mays founded what was the third ever public school with an Indigenous curriculum in Detroit in the 1990s. And my great-grandmother was involved in a lot of like Indigenous activism back in the day in Detroit as well. It's a way to honor them, talk about some of the cool things that they've done, and to think about how when you talk about Detroit, people are like, man, downtown Detroit is like booming. And I just had to go back for some family stuff, but what about the rest of Detroit? And thinking about the narratives that have been circulating via social media, via Dan Gilbert. I'm a Dan Gilbert hater, by the way. Making Detroit come back. but they focus on the downtown and core, and they talk about Detroit as if people don't live there, as in black people, right? So they still have these settler colonial logics that happened in the creation of the United States. Look, we found this land to change. Remember in 2013, it said just west of Bushwick, go to Detroit, as if it's a land, a frontier that is meant to be conquered and settled by other people. Right? It's a majority black city. So those people are completely invisible, right? So the same settler colonial narratives. And that's what I was trying to get at in City of Dispossession. And finally, I'm finishing a book, which you got a little preview today. I'm still working on the title. I'm not satisfied with that yet, but it looks at reparations and decolonization historically, today, and how do we think about them together. And one of the things I did not talk about today were like urban indigenous land returns, which Tulsa, of course, with the McGirt decision is at least a little bit a part of that story. So that should be out with Haymarket. And my editor is probably upset at me. Hopefully she doesn't see this talk and was like, why are you talking? I thought you were gonna get these edits done. So hopefully those edits will be done in a month, and hopefully the book will be out with Haymarket, a leftist press, in I think at the end of 2025 or early 2026.
Thank you. Question from KO. What do you think about res dogs? And do you think pop culture has the potential to educate the public more than comparable to historians?
Yes and no. Res Dogs was dope. I don't have anything else to say that. Like, if you haven't, I hope everyone on here has seen Red Dogs. If you haven't, go check it out. Amazing story, a lot of Oklahoma, a lot of dope people involved in it. Pop culture certainly has a role to play, and I think it can do a great job of educating the masses. That is, remember, pop culture wasn't very popular in its origins. The term was really meant to denigrate working class and poor people. On the other hand, with the amount of social media and misinformation and the desire for people to go viral, it is often just a capitalist enterprise. And with indigenous popular culture in particular, sometimes it can just get stale and people that you're hating. I'm not this old, but I'm dating myself as a historian in a sense. Do y'all remember the Apollo Theater? Like the 60s, 70s one? When people get booed off stage, right? We need some version of an indigenous Apollo theater to boo work that is corny or whack, right? And what I'm really talking about is cultural critique. Cultural critique, like for instance, I hate when like Drake just dropped an album or Kendrick dropped an album recently, and you have all these think pieces on social media. And it's like immediate. What happened to sitting with that for like a month or two and a long think piece? I know people hate reading these days. A long think piece where you have to sit and read it over a cup of coffee for like 30, 40 minutes, right? Because they spent real time doing it. We need cultural critique and indigenous cultural things. So sometimes, do we really need another male chief on a t-shirt, for example? Like, I'm not hating on people's business or whatever, but what about something that's just abstract? Like, I like visual art. Can it be, why is that not considered indigenous? An indigenous person made it, right? Is that not indigenous art? Just a broader conversation. And the entire conversation around cultural appropriation. Yes, it happens, right? But sometimes it's such a focus on that and it's reactionary and not focused on building and creating really dope indigenous art. And there are a lot of really dope indigenous artists out there, right? But sometimes, like, cultural appropriation. What about focusing on the development of the art and the cultural critique of that art so it gets better? That's what I'm mostly invested in.
Thank you. Only have time for a few more questions. Please, if you're in the chat, please throw out a couple more questions as we begin to wrap up. I'm gonna stick with this last question and pivot a little bit. Talk to me about, you're a historian and a professional historian. Can you talk to me or say something about this notion of like professional historians and how that identity, that training works in concert with Afro-Indigenous, historical, cultural notions of history making, history transmission? What's going on with this notion as a historian from the academy doing this type of work, and what's going on when we're thinking about other notions of who is the griot, who is the historian, who is the tradition keeper?
Yeah, I mean, it's when you still stay connected with family and community, it can be a little strange because now people think I'm an expert on all sorts of things from politics. I'm like, I have thoughts about these, but I'm not an expert, and maybe my thoughts are like way beyond what you're asking. Or two, I'm not someone like I believe in critical thinking and reading, etc. I don't debate with people who don't read. I never will. We can have different ideological opinions on something, of course, but if we're not reading or have the same level of like basic information, then what is the point of arguing? This is for y'all who like to argue with people on social media. Shout out to you. I will never do that in my life, nor do I have the energy to do that. But I think at least I think that's what I'm hearing, the role of, historian, Black, Indigenous, Afro-Indigenous historians, is to uncover and reclaim histories. But it can't solely be about one's career. And of course, part of my career is to write books for tenure, yada, yada, yada. Beacon Press is not an academic press. A-Market is not an academic press. And I think I'm probably over academic presses for the rest of my life because I don't have to do it anymore. And what ways can historians disseminate information? And like even the thing that happened on TikTok, and I am not on TikTok, but it was pretty cool to hear about the the Hillman University thing on TikTok. There's a Black woman professor who just had her class and information, and it kind of blew up. So in other words, what are all the ways we can educate young people about history, about all sort of things? I think there's two things. Continue, we need reading groups, again, reading groups. And reading, for me, could be listening to sharing music, watching documentaries. Don't forget the actual reading of a book too, though. And then talking about those things in a very critical manner. I mean, the second thing I learned from is going door to door, right? Still working with your community and going door to door and having that community connection and talking with people about ideas. All those things, to me, are still very, very important.
Thank you.
One last thing. And if you have a community space, please lend it out to young people. Have historians and educators, organizers utilize your space for a nominal fee, whatever, to be able to talk and educate and work with young people. I think that's very important now more than ever.
Thank you. I have a question from one of our professors about the cultural critique. And does that require clarifying who is the culture and how difficult is that with such mixture of identities? So when we're thinking about the pop culture and the cultural critique, this is a question really trying to get at with all the intersectionalities and the diverse identities. What's that look like?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm the worst person to answer this. It's like identity politics gone wrong. I like identity politics and the way that the Combahee River Collective defined identity politics. And if you never read the Combahee River Collective statement, please go read that. It's just amazing. And sometimes it's a question of authenticity or essentialism, really. In other words, some folks might say, I'm Black, therefore I know hip hop, therefore I'm the only one that can comment on it. I'm Indigenous, I know how this visual art works, therefore I'm the only one who can comment on it. And I'm someone who doesn't believe in that. Like, I think there's value in someone's identity and talking about certain sorts of things, but I think it limits cultural critique. And I think, of course, one has to be careful, has to be at least connected to a community, cultural appreciation. Community is still fundamental to that, of course, at all times, but I think sometimes we can be such in a silo about these people can only comment on this, these people can only comment on that. And it limits the ability to think broadly across sorts of different genres. I mean, I think I was having this conversation with a friend recently about all sorts of music we learned back in the day just by watching VH1. Things in the 60s, 70s, having to wait for a music video to drop, and you had to watch alternative rock or some, what I would describe back in the day as some like weirdo music, right? But then if I hear something now, why do I know this? Right now, it's just algorithms like determining what you're listening to if you don't already have a broad set of understanding music. So that's just a long way to mention that identity is important. what is the culture is important, but that's up to us to determine. This is why I mentioned Frantz Fanon's on national culture, of course, Stuart Hall as well. I think those things are still more valuable now than ever.
Okay, last two questions before I let you go. One, I'm gonna let you return briefly to decolonization and solidarity. You mentioned people discussing decolonization of curriculums, decolonizations of this and that, and then you return specifically to your definition of decolonization. And decolonization requires two things, you said: the return of land to indigenous peoples and the eradication of colonialism. So as we're thinking about decolonization, as we're taking the insights from your current study on land reparations and economic justice, talk to us briefly, just close out with what does decolonized curriculum look like? What does decolonized teaching look like from the perspective of your talk tonight?
I don't know. And I think decolonization, to be clear, is a process, right? It's a process that is in motion, and there are certain fundamental goals that need to be established about what is a community trying to accomplish with decolonization. Now, if I had to put it into practice in a sense, I would say teaching within community institutions, whatever that means. Like, how do you take the information you might learn in the academy, for example, and educate different communities? I think a group I talked to recently in London, it's called Decolonizing the Archives. They do a lot of cool things around whether it's psychological healing, talking about the rematriation of African objects and so forth, doing things within the community as well. And I think those things are forms of decolonization in motion, if you will. Not enough, but certainly a part of the process that aren't always tied to lecture conversation. They're pretty interactive with some of the cool things that they do.
Thank you. And our last question for the evening comes from one of our committee members and professors at Phillips. Deals with about reparative justice between Black and Native communities, and specifically without going through the colonial state. She understands that you are not claiming to have discovered a definite way forward, but would you be open to sharing any ideas on this, on pursuit of reparative justice and solidarity between Black and Native communities with bypassing the colonial state, so that we can begin thinking, and specifically, what role do you believe religious communities might play in this process?
Yeah, I think I'll go backwards. I mean, I think religious communities can do certain roles. Even back in the day, one of the things I think they did a very good job of was opening up spaces for communities to meet. And by meeting, I at least have a vision of Black and Native communities meeting to having real hard conversations around, slavery, maybe some nation enslaved some folks. How can we repair those harms? What kind of cultural, historical, and political misinformation do we have about one another? How can we resolve those? And these things will require, I think sometimes mistake loud talking and precise language, precise questioning as arguing. And if you have family, you got loud family, or New Yorkers or whatever it is, right? They just be loud for no reason. Like, I'm pretty mild mannered. I have loud family, and I just look at them like. But if someone outside of that, or sometimes how my brother and I will talk, or curt language, it's not personal. It's not meant to be harmful. It's just to get clarity on something. And it has to be multi-generational, right? You get some elders, you get some young people, and the elders, I think, should certainly listen to the young people and their ideas as well, right? So you have to have this pendulum of relationships happening and having those hard conversations. And without those, I don't think we're gonna move forward at all.
Wow, I hear vulnerability, I hear diversity, I hear respect, and I hear bravery, courage.
One last thing. I feel like I'm talking a lot here. Religious communities, and this is speaking of vulnerability. My cousin was murdered last year in Detroit, and so my brother and I, and she was Christian, Native, Black, Afro-Native woman, Christian, and so she's also practiced at least some of our spiritual practices, right? And my brother and I smudged her body and did like some of the cultural things that we were kind of forced into in a sense, just from a lot of historical trauma, whatever. So we're smudging her body, and the preacher was just kind of like, "What's that's why, I respect men of the cloth, but he almost got rolled that day because it's, yes, she was a Christian, but this is also a part of her, I would say, her Christianity, her spiritual practice, that she would have wanted her cousins to do these certain things, and we're doing them within the realm of a Christian space, right? But it doesn't mean it's sacrilegious or it's othering, and the kind of disrespect I think that religious institutions and leaders can sort of do to ignore certain things like that are just disrespectful, right? We weren't being disrespectful. Like, we appreciate the men of the cloth, people of the cloth, women of the cloth, and so forth, but we still have to do this for her own spiritual journey, right? And when you're doing ceremonies like that, just like, hey, is there anything that we can help you with or that's going to happen? Just want to make sure we're open about it.
I appreciate that vulnerability, and that I think is a lesson for all of us. That thank you. Thank you. And again, I thank you for your entire lecture. I've got a series of questions that I will take offline. But again, everyone online, please join me in thanking Dr. Mays for this enriching and informative lecture. Thank you all online for joining with us. If you have any other questions, please pass them along, and we will try to get them to Dr. Mays. Good night, and God bless.